Congratulations, you're getting married. You did not entirely choose this. That is to say, you may have had some input into the decision, a glancing consultation with your preferences, a brief acknowledgement that you exist as a person with feelings about the matter. But the degree to which your own desires were the primary organizing principle of this arrangement depends heavily on who you are, where you are, what year it is, and most importantly, how much land your family has. The more land, the less your feelings matter. This is not a coincidence. This is the medieval marriage system operating exactly as designed. You are somewhere in Western Europe, let's say France or England or the Germanic territories, the heartland of the medieval Catholic world, where the Church has spent the better part of 8 centuries developing an extraordinarily complex set of rules about who can marry whom, under what circumstances, with what rituals, producing what legal consequences, and dissolving under which conditions that are almost never the ones you're currently hoping apply to your situation. The year is somewhere between 1000 and 1400, not a precise date, because the medieval marriage system changed across this period, became more regulated, more institutionalized, more thoroughly entangled with canon law and ecclesiastical courts and the specific bureaucratic ambitions of a church that was simultaneously the most powerful institution in Europe and deeply personally invested in what happened in your bedroom. The specific year matters for the specific details. The broad picture is consistent enough that we can draw it without pinning it to a particular century. You are about to get married. And married life in the Middle Ages was, depending on who you were, whom you married, what your social class demanded of you, and what decade of your marriage you happened to be navigating. By turns tender, brutal, legally fascinating, theologically overcomplicated, economically ruthless, occasionally transcendently loving, and almost never what you expected. Let's start at the beginning, or rather let's start before the beginning, at the moment when the marriage was decided, which is where everything in the medieval system actually started, and which was considerably earlier and considerably less romantic than the beginning you might have imagined. Chapter 1. The Arrangement. How medieval marriages were decided and by whom. The first thing you need to understand about medieval marriage is that it was not primarily about you. This is not a cynical observation. It is a structural one. The medieval marriage was, at its foundation, an economic and political transaction between families. A transfer of property, the establishment of alliances, the management of land, the production of legitimate heirs, and the resolution of various social obligations that had nothing directly to do with the two people, who were going to be sharing a bed for the foreseeable future. The fact that you had feelings about the person you were going to marry was, in most medieval contexts, a pleasant bonus if it happened, and a manageable inconvenience if it didn't. The degree to which your personal preferences were consulted varied enormously by social class, and understanding that variation is essential to understanding how the system actually worked. If you were aristocratic, if your family held land, title, or political significance, your marriage was a diplomatic event. Negotiations began years before the wedding, sometimes decades, sometimes before you were born. The children of aristocratic families were betrothed in infancy, their future unions decided by the calculations of parents and advisors, and sometimes kings who were managing territorial interests, alliance structures, and inheritance questions that had nothing to do with whether the two small children who had been promised to each other were going to get along. The child betrothal was real and common in the aristocratic context, and it produced some situations that, from a modern perspective, look extraordinary. A girl of 2 betrothed to a boy of 5. A 3-year-old boy promised to a 7-year-old girl whose family held a strategic castle. These arrangements were not considered marriages. Canon law eventually established clear minimum ages for valid marriage, 12 for girls, 14 for boys, on the theory that these were the ages of puberty and therefore the threshold of capacity to consent and consummate. But they were binding social and legal commitments that structured the lives of the children who were subject to them from an age before they could understand what marriage meant. Betrothals could be dissolved. though dissolving them required negotiation, compensation, and sometimes the kind of political fallout that made dissolution more expensive than continuation. Families who had promised children to each other had created an expectation, a commitment, and sometimes a financial arrangement, the dowry, the bride price, the various property transfers that were part of the deal. That dissolution disrupted in ways that rippled outward. Through the alliance networks, the betrothal was designed to serve. If you were from the merchant class, the growing urban population of the high and late medieval period, the people of the towns and guilds and commercial networks, your marriage was more about business than politics, but no less calculated. A merchant family chose spouses for their children based on the wealth of the other family, their commercial connections, their reputation in the trade networks, the desirability of an alliance between their business interests and yours. Love was not the organizing principle. Commercial advantage was. The guild system, which regulated most skilled urban trades in the medieval period, was deeply entangled with the marriage system. Membership in a guild could be inherited, or it could be obtained through marriage to the daughter of a guild master. A young man who wanted to establish himself in a trade might find that marrying the right woman, the master's daughter, the widow of an established craftsman, was the most direct route to the professional standing he needed. The marriage was a business transaction with a human being attached. If you were a peasant, if you were among the majority of the medieval population who worked the land and owed various obligations to the lords who owned it, your marriage was constrained in specific ways that distinguished it from both the aristocratic and merchant models. In many parts of medieval Europe, peasants who were serfs, bound to the land, owing labor and other dues to their lord, required the lord's permission to marry. This was not merely a formality. The lord had a genuine interest in controlling the marriages of his serfs because marriage determined household composition, labor availability, and the production of future serfs who would work the land and pay dues. The merchet, a payment made to the lord for permission to marry, or for permission for a daughter to marry, was a real financial transaction in the English manorial system and its equivalents elsewhere. The lord was not giving his blessing out of goodwill. He was being compensated for the economic disruption of the marriage, the potential loss of labor from his lands if the woman married out of the manor, the addition of an obligation if a man married in. The lord's permission was required and was paid for. And yet, here is where the medieval marriage system becomes genuinely interesting and genuinely complicated. The church had something quite different to say about all of this. The church's position on marriage consent developed over the 12th and 13th centuries through the work of canon lawyers and theologians, and eventually, codified in ways that had enormous practical consequences, was revolutionary for its time. A valid marriage required the free consent of both parties, not the consent of their parents, not the approval of their lord, the consent of the man and the woman who were getting married. This is the doctrine of consent, and it was, in the context of medieval social reality, genuinely radical. It meant that a marriage made under coercion was not a valid marriage. It meant that children who had been betrothed by their parents could, upon reaching the age of majority and the canonical minimum age, refuse to complete the marriage, and the refusal would be recognized by ecclesiastical courts. It meant that a serf who married without the lord's permission had still contracted a valid marriage, even if the lord had a legal claim for the unpaid merchant. The gap between the church's consent doctrine and the social reality of arranged marriage, family pressure, and lordly control was one of the defining tensions of medieval marriage law. It produced a situation in which the legal framework said one thing, and the social reality operated according to something else entirely. And the courts, both ecclesiastical courts dealing with marriage validity and secular courts dealing with property consequences, spent enormous amounts of time adjudicating the collisions between the two. What did consent actually mean in practice? The most famous expression of the medieval consent doctrine was the verbal formula that constituted a valid marriage. If a man and woman said to each other, in words of the present tense, something equivalent to, "I take you as my husband/wife," they were married, not engaged, not promised to each other, actually legally married, no church ceremony required, no priest required, No witnesses required in most canonical formulations. The words of present consent, the verba de praesenti, were the sacrament, and the sacrament required only the two people saying the words. This had enormous practical consequences. It meant that two people who wanted to marry despite their family's opposition could do so by simply saying the words to each other, and the resulting marriage, however socially scandalous, was legally valid. It meant that a man who seduced a woman with a promise of marriage, then claimed the promise was only a future promise rather than present consent, might find himself in an ecclesiastical court being pressed to clarify what exactly he had said. It meant that the definition of who was married and who wasn't was considerably more fluid and contested than the formal ceremony would suggest. The clandestine marriage, the marriage made without witnesses, without ceremony, without family knowledge, was a constant source of legal dispute in the medieval period. Ecclesiastical courts heard cases of people claiming that a clandestine marriage had taken place, or denying that a clandestine marriage had taken place, or arguing about whether what had been said constituted present consent or future promise. The ambiguity was real because the law created it. If words were sufficient to make a marriage, then the content and intent of those words became legally crucial and frequently disputed. The Church eventually, at the Council of Trent in the 16th century, which is technically outside our period but represents the culmination of medieval processes, required witnesses and the presence of a priest for a valid marriage, closing the loophole that the consent doctrine had created. But throughout the medieval period, the loophole was open, and people used it. So, you are getting married. Whether your marriage was arranged by your parents, negotiated by your guild, required your lord's permission, or conducted clandestinely in a field somewhere because the two of you said the words and the church said that was sufficient, you are, or are about to be, in the institution of medieval matrimony. Let's talk about what happened next. Chapter 2. The wedding. What the ceremony actually looked like. You are standing at the door of the church, not inside the church, at the door. This is important because the medieval wedding ceremony, for most of the period we're discussing, was conducted at the church door rather than inside the building. The inside of the church was for the Mass that followed, and the nuptial Mass was the religious celebration of a marriage that had already been contracted outside. The contracting happened at the door. Why the door? Partly because the threshold was a meaningful liminal space in medieval symbolic geography. You were literally standing between the outside world and the sacred interior, between the secular contract and the religious blessing. Partly because the church door was a public space, where the community could witness the proceedings, where any objection could be raised, where the publicity of the marriage contract could be established, and partly because the arrangements being made at the door, the property transfers, the dowry agreements, the practical economic business of the marriage, were secular transactions that were appropriately conducted outside the sacred space, even if they were being conducted in front of a priest. The priest was there. He had been there for the reading of the banns, the announcement made in the parish church on 3 consecutive Sundays or feast days before the wedding, of the intended marriage and the names of the parties, inviting anyone who knew of a legal impediment to speak up. The banns were the church's mechanism for the public verification of consent. If the bride had already promised herself to someone else, if the groom was already married, if the two were too closely related for canonical law to permit their union, the banns gave people the opportunity to say so before, rather than after. The impediments to marriage in medieval canon law were numerous and occasionally surprising. Consanguinity, blood relationship, was the most obvious. You couldn't marry certain relatives, but the medieval definition of consanguinity extended to the 7th degree, which meant theoretically that you couldn't marry anyone you shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent with. This was essentially everyone in a small village, which created practical problems that the church acknowledged and eventually addressed by reducing the prohibited degree to the 4th. Affinity, the relationship created by marriage, extended the restrictions further. If your brother had married someone, her relatives were your affines, and certain marriages between you and them were also prohibited. Spiritual kinship, the relationship created by godparenthood, added another layer. Your godparents and their children were your spiritual relatives, and certain marriages within that network were also prohibited. In a medieval community where the same families were godparents to each other's children repeatedly across generations, this could eliminate a significant portion of the potential marriage pool. The dispensation, the church's permission to marry despite an impediment, was available, but it cost money, required a formal application to an ecclesiastical authority, and was more readily available to those who could pay for it. The aristocratic families who were perpetually marrying their cousins to keep land consolidated had regular business with the dispensation system. The peasant family in a small village, trying to navigate the impediment network with a much smaller marriageable population, had the same need and considerably less access to the solution. Standing at the door then, the priest is asking the formal questions, the questions that establish consent, that confirm the absence of legal impediments, that transform two people who have walked up to a church door into a legally married couple. Do you take this woman? Do you take this man? The answers, spoken in the presence of witnesses, are the verba de presenti that constitute the marriage. And then the ring. The ring was placed on the bride's finger. In the English tradition, moved progressively across the first three fingers of the right hand, while the priest invoked the Trinity, then settled on the fourth finger of the right hand. Medieval rings went on the right hand, not the left, on the theory that a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. The vena amoris, the vein of love, is anatomically fictional, but its symbolic function was real. The ring on the finger connected to the heart marked the woman as married, as belonging to a specific man in the specific way that medieval property law organized belonging. The ring was exclusively the woman's. The man didn't receive one. This is a modern innovation. The double ring ceremony, in which both partners exchange rings, became common in the 20th century. In the medieval period, the ring was the husband's gift to the wife, and it was his claim on her, not a mutual exchange of claims. The symbolism was directional. Along with the ring came other gifts: the endowment, the husband's public declaration of what property he was giving his wife as her dower, the portion of his estate that would support her if he died first. With this ring I thee wed, with this gold and silver I thee endow. The words that accompanied the ring were explicitly economic, connecting the romantic symbol of the ring to the practical financial arrangement that was the marriage's material foundation. The dower was typically a third of the husband's lands, and the public statement at the church door established the wife's claim in a legally recognized way. After the door ceremony, the party moved inside for the nuptial mass. The mass was the blessing of the marriage, already contracted, the religious celebration that situated the secular transaction within the sacred framework of the church. The couple knelt at the altar. A cloth or canopy held over them, the care cloth or nuptial veil, symbolizing the new household they were creating. Prayers were said, blessings were given. The marriage was complete. And then, in most medieval contexts, the celebration began, because whatever else the Middle Ages were, they were not opposed to a party. The medieval wedding feast, the wedding banquet that followed the ceremony, was one of the great social occasions of medieval life, and the investment in it by families at all social levels was significant. The feast was display. It was the public performance of the family's social status, their generosity, their ability to provide abundance for their community. Guests were fed, often lavishly by the standards of the time. Food and drink were provided in quantities that signaled prosperity. Music was played, dancing happened. The wedding feast was the occasion on which the new household announced itself to the community, and the announcement was made through hospitality. The duration of wedding feasts varied by class and custom. In aristocratic contexts, they could last for days, multiple days of feasting, entertainment, tournaments. If the family was wealthy enough, the extended celebration of an alliance that had political as well as social significance. In peasant communities, the feast was more modest, but no less important within its scale. a day of celebration in which the community came together to mark the new union, to eat and drink at the host family's expense, and to participate in the rituals that welcomed the couple into their new status. The rituals included some that were significantly less dignified than the church ceremony. The bedding ceremony, the escorting of the couple to their marriage bed by the wedding guests, with prayers and blessings said over them. And in some traditions, the guests present, for at least the initial moments of the couple being put to bed together, was a real medieval custom, and its function was practical as well as symbolic. The witnesses to the bedding could attest that the marriage had been consummated, which was legally significant. A marriage that had been consummated was considerably more difficult to annul than one that hadn't. Consummation transformed the marriage's legal status. It activated the full property arrangements. It meant that the husband's claim on the wife and the wife's claim on the dower were fully established. It was, in the medieval legal framework, the final act that completed the marriage. And the guests who witnessed the bedding were, whether they thought of it this way or not, witnesses to this final legal act. You are, by the end of this long day, married. The door ceremony, the mass, the feast, the bedding. You have moved through all of them. You are in a new legal status, a new economic arrangement, a new social position. You are a household. Now the actual married life begins. And this is where things get genuinely interesting. Chapter 3. The household. What the basic unit of medieval married life actually was. You live in a house. This seems obvious, but the medieval house and the medieval household that organized life within and around it was a different kind of structure than the modern concept of home suggests. And understanding what it was is essential to understanding what married life inside it meant. The medieval household was an economic unit, not primarily an emotional unit, not primarily a domestic retreat from the outside world, not the private sphere of personal life that the modern home represents. It was a productive enterprise, a unit of agricultural production, of craft production, of commercial activity, in which the husband and wife were the managing partners, and in which the boundary between work and home was essentially non-existent because they occupied the same physical space. For the vast majority of the medieval population, the peasant farmers who constituted somewhere between 85 and 90% of the people, the household was the farm. The peasant house was not separate from the agricultural enterprise. It was, in many cases, literally attached to the animal quarters. The longhouse, a structure in which human living space and animal stabling occupied the same building, separated by a low wall or a partial partition, was common in many parts of Northern and Western Europe. The animals were inside, partly because keeping them inside protected them from theft and from the elements, and partly because their body heat contributed meaningfully to warming the human living space in winter. This is not a poverty arrangement exactly. It was the standard domestic architecture of the majority of the European population, not a marker of unusual destitution. But it means that your medieval home, as a married couple, smells like the farm because it is the farm. The chickens are inside. The pig may be inside. The cow or the ox, depending on what you could afford, is inside the other end of the building. The floor is packed earth, covered with rushes or straw that were changed periodically but not constantly. The smell of the medieval peasant home was the smell of animals, of cooking smoke from the central hearth. Most peasant homes did not have chimneys. The smoke rose through a hole in the thatch or just drifted around until it found an exit. Of unwashed human bodies, of the fermentation of the ale that was brewed domestically as a routine household task. The house was small. The typical peasant house was a single room, or at most 2 rooms in which everything happened: cooking, eating, sleeping, storage, childcare, and whatever craft work the family did for supplementary income. There was no privacy within the house. There was no separation of function. The bed, if there was, a bed rather than a straw mattress on the floor, was in the same room as the food preparation area, which was in the same room as the children's sleeping space, which was in the same room as whatever agricultural equipment didn't fit in the outbuildings. The concept of domestic privacy as modern people understand it, the expectation that certain activities, certain conversations, certain moments of personal life are conducted in spaces that others don't enter, was essentially absent in this context, not because medieval people didn't value any privacy, but because the physical structure of their living space didn't permit the kind of spatial separation that privacy in the modern sense requires. For the aristocratic household, the picture was physically different but structurally similar in important ways. The medieval castle or manor house was large, multiple rooms, specialized spaces for different functions, the hall as the center of communal life, the solar or private chamber as the more personal space of the lord and lady. But the aristocratic household was also full of people. Servants, retainers, household officers, guests, visitors, children and their nurses, the various people whose presence was required for the functioning of an aristocratic estate. The lord and lady's life was not private in the modern sense either. They were surrounded constantly by the people whose service maintained the household. The lady's chamber, the solar, the private room, was more private than the great hall, but it was still routinely occupied by the lady's attendants, by visiting women, by the children. The concept of the couple having time genuinely alone, in the modern sense of domestic privacy, was unusual, and when it occurred was the result of deliberate effort rather than the default of daily life. The household also included, in most medieval contexts, more people than the nuclear family. Extended family members, a widowed parent, an unmarried sibling, a nephew learning a trade, might live in the household. Servants of various kinds lived in, sleeping in the same spaces as the family or in attached outbuildings. Apprentices, in craft households, lived with the master and his family. The household was a permeable institution, with its membership expanding and contracting based on family circumstances, economic conditions, and the various obligations of hospitality and mutual support that medieval social networks imposed. In this context, the married couple was the center of the household, the managing partners of the economic enterprise. But they were not isolated within it. They were embedded in a network of other people, other relationships, other obligations. The marriage was not a private relationship between two people who had chosen each other. It was the institutional center of a larger social and economic unit. Now let's talk about what the husband and wife actually did, because the division of labor within the medieval household was specific and consequential. The husband's domain was, broadly, the exterior, the fields, the market, the legal and political obligations of the household to its lord and to the broader community. He was responsible for the agricultural production that provided the household's income and food supply. He was responsible for the military obligations that came with land tenure, the feudal obligation to perform military service or to pay a fee in lieu of it that was attached to the holding of land. He appeared in court as the household's legal representative. He managed the relationships with the lord, with the church, with the market where surplus production was sold. The wife's domain was, broadly, the interior, the management of the house, the dairy, the poultry, the vegetable garden, the textile production, the care of the children, the cooking and brewing and preserving that kept the household fed through the year. But the word interior understates the scope of the wife's responsibilities, because in the medieval peasant household, the interior was not small. The wife was managing a complex productive enterprise that included the dairy herd's milk, processing into butter and cheese for sale, and consumption, the poultry flock's eggs and meat, the vegetable garden's production, the household brewing that produced the ale that was the household's primary beverage, the textile production that clothed the family and potentially produced surplus for sale, and the full domestic management of feeding, clothing, and maintaining everyone in the household. The medieval wife was not a domestic appendage. She was a co-manager of the household enterprise, responsible for a specific and extensive domain of productive activity without which the household could not function. The wife's labor was not supplementary to the husband's. It was complementary to it, different in character but equivalent in importance to the household's survival. This is, in some ways, a more genuinely egalitarian economic model. then various later arrangements in which women's domestic work was rendered invisible by being excluded from the category of real work. Medieval law and social understanding recognized that the wife's contribution was real and had value, not equal value in a legal or social status sense. The husband was the household's head, the legal representative, the person whose name appeared in the legal records, but recognized value in the sense that the loss of a wife through death or incapacity was understood to be a serious economic problem for the household, not merely a personal loss. The widow of a peasant farmer was a household manager who had lost her co-manager. The widower was the same. Both needed to replace the lost partner through remarriage, through employing labor, through family support, in order to keep the household economically viable. The urgency of remarriage in the medieval period was not only about loneliness or social convention, it was about the economic survival of a household that was structured around the complementary labor of two people and couldn't function indefinitely with one. Let's look at the specific daily texture of what this partnership looked like in practice, because the broad categories of exterior and interior don't capture the granular reality of a medieval married day. You wake before dawn. This is not a choice. The agricultural calendar and the animal care obligations of the household do not respect the modern concept of sleeping until you feel rested. The animals need attending at a specific time. The workday in the fields starts at a specific time. The bread, if it's a baking day, needs to have been started the night before and needs attention first thing in the morning. The household's rhythms are organized around the agricultural calendar, the liturgical calendar, and the animal care requirements. And none of these calendars are particularly interested in how you feel about 4:30 in the morning. The morning involves, simultaneously, the husband seeing to the animals and preparing for the day's fieldwork, and the wife beginning the food preparation, the morning dairy tasks, if applicable, the organization of the children for whatever they need to be doing. The medieval household's morning is a coordinated burst of activity that requires both managing partners to be functional and moving. And this is where the texture of medieval marriage reveals itself most clearly. It was, at its most basic level, a working partnership. The emotional content, love, affection, friendship, the various things that modern people consider the primary content of marriage, was present, and we'll discuss it at length. But the foundation was the work, the shared enterprise, the daily coordination of two people managing a complex household in a demanding physical environment. Whether you liked your spouse or not, you worked alongside them. Whether the marriage had been arranged for you or chosen by you, you shared the same small space, the same economic fate, the same daily rhythms. The proximity was total. The shared stakes were complete. Whatever your marriage had been at the wedding door, by the time you had been in it for a year, it had been shaped by the specific, intense, intimate experience of living and working in close quarters with another person on whom your survival practically depended. That shapes people. That shapes relationships. And the medieval marriages that produced genuine affection and genuine partnership, and there were many of them, were often the product of that shaping, of the particular bond that forms between people who have been through a great deal together in a small space and have found, in the process, that they are glad of each other. Chapter 4. Love and Affection. Whether medieval people actually liked each other here is the question that everyone has when they think about arranged marriage. Did they love each other? And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes it developed, sometimes it didn't. And the medieval understanding of how love and marriage were supposed to relate to each other was considerably more nuanced than either the cynical, it was just economics dismissal, or the romantic, they found love in the midst of hardship, idealization. Let's start with what the medieval sources actually say about love in marriage, because the sources are more varied and more interesting than the popular narrative suggests. The literature of courtly love, the poems and romances that are the most famous expression of medieval attitudes toward romantic feeling, presents love and marriage as essentially incompatible. The courtly love tradition developed in the 12th century troubadour poetry of southern France and spreading across European aristocratic culture celebrated a specific kind of love, passionate, ennobling, directed at a woman who was idealized and often unattainable, frequently because she was married to someone else. The beloved of courtly poetry was typically another man's wife, and the love was typically unconsummated, or at least not supposed to be consummated, which was partly what made it so nobly painful. This tradition, in which real love happened outside marriage, between a knight and a lady who were not and could not be married to each other, has been taken by many historians as evidence that medieval people didn't expect to love their spouses. That love was a category of feeling reserved for the impossible or the illicit, while marriage was a category of arrangement reserved for the practical. This reading overinterprets the literary evidence. Courtly love literature was a specific genre with specific conventions and a specific social function. It was entertainment for aristocratic audiences, and its presentation of love as impossible and agonizing was a literary convention, not a straightforward description of how aristocratic people actually organized their emotional lives. Reading courtly poetry as a factual account of medieval attitudes toward love and marriage would be like reading modern romantic comedies as a factual account of how people in the 21st century think about relationships. The actual evidence, the letters, the legal records, the theological discussions, the practical literature of advice and management gives a more varied picture. Medieval theologians and marriage theorists, from at least the 12th century onward, were increasingly interested in the idea that spouses should love each other, not the agonized passion of courtly romance. That kind of love was considered dangerous and potentially sinful in its intensity, but the affection, the companionship, the genuine fondness of people who had built a life together. This was increasingly recognized as both possible and desirable within marriage. The influential 13th century theologian Albertus Magnus wrote that a husband should love his wife as a companion with the kind of measured, steady affection that was appropriate to a permanent partnership. This was not the burning passion of the troubadours, but it was love. The letters that survive from medieval married couples, the ones lucky enough to have been preserved by historical accident, sometimes reveal genuine affection with a directness that crosses the centuries without difficulty. The Paston Letters, the correspondence of a 15th century English gentry family, contain letters between married couples and between people negotiating marriages that show, alongside the economics and the property disputes and the legal arguments, real human warmth and real human feeling. Margaret Paston wrote to her husband John with news of the household and the estate, and the various crises that required his attention, and the tone, practical, competent, clearly the voice of a woman managing a complex household on her own while her husband was away on business, is also, unmistakably, the tone of a person who is glad to be connected to the person she's writing to, not effusive, not romantic in any courtly sense, but warm and particular, and present in the way that you are present when writing to someone whose absence you notice. The love that developed in medieval marriages was, in many cases, the love that develops between people who work closely together, who face difficulty together, who depend on each other practically, and find, in that dependence, a foundation for something more than just utility. It was the love of partnership, of mutual knowledge, of the specific intimacy that comes from sharing the same small space for years. It was not always passionate, it was often durable, and there were genuinely passionate marriages too. Medieval sources document couples who were clearly in love with each other in a way that went beyond fond partnership, who wrote about each other with a warmth that the centuries haven't cooled. Heloise and Abelard are the most famous medieval love story, though theirs was tragic, and the marriage at its center was hidden and complicated. But outside the famous cases, the ordinary marriages of the medieval period also produced ordinary love, the kind that doesn't get recorded in literature because it isn't dramatic enough, but that left traces in the letters and the wills and the small gestures preserved in the historical record. The will was, in fact, one of the most revealing documents for medieval marital affection. The way a medieval person disposed of their property at death tells you something about whom they loved and whom they valued. A peasant man who left his wife more than the legal minimum required, who specified that she should have the better land, the more comfortable arrangements, the provisions that would make her widowhood less difficult, was making a statement about his feelings in the only formal document available to him for that purpose. Many medieval wills make exactly these statements. They are not love letters, but they are evidence of love in the specific practical language available to people who expressed their feelings through concrete provision rather than romantic declaration. Now, the other side of this, because the evidence of medieval marital love is real and significant, but so is the evidence that medieval marriages could be miserable, and understanding both sides is part of the honest account. The economic reality of medieval marriage meant that couples who were incompatible, who didn't like each other, who found each other difficult or unkind, or simply wrong for them in various ways, were nonetheless bound together, living in the same small space, managing the same enterprise, dependent on each other's cooperation for the household's survival. There was no divorce in the modern sense. The church permitted separation, living apart, in cases of extreme circumstances, but the marriage bond itself was indissoluble. You were in it, whatever it was. The medieval ecclesiastical courts heard cases of marital breakdown, of spouses trying to escape marriages they found intolerable, of the various strategies, claiming a prior contract, claiming consanguinity that hadn't been disclosed, claiming coercion at the original ceremony, that people deployed to get out of marriages the church didn't want them to leave. These cases reveal in their specifics the texture of marriages that had failed, the abuse, the abandonment, the fundamental incompatibility of people who had been put together by arrangement and found themselves unable to build anything from the arrangement. The annulment, the church's declaration that a valid marriage had never existed, was the closest thing to divorce available in medieval canon law. It required proving that some impediment had existed at the time of the marriage that made it invalid from the beginning. Prior contract, consanguinity, coercion, impotence at the time of the wedding. The annulment didn't dissolve a valid marriage. It declared that the marriage had never been valid, that the impediment had prevented validity from ever being achieved. Getting an annulment required money, access to ecclesiastical courts, legal knowledge or representation, and the ability to construct a convincing case from the canonical grounds available. It was not accessible to everyone, and the grounds were not always available even to people who had them, because proving that a prior contract had existed or that the groom had been impotent at the time of the wedding required evidence that was often difficult to produce. Powerful people, wealthy enough to navigate the court system, well connected enough to influence the proceedings, were more likely to obtain annulments than poor people. This is not a surprise, but the inequality of access to the exit from marriage is part of the full picture of medieval married life. The institution was genuinely binding in ways that fell more heavily on those who couldn't afford the legal mechanisms that theoretically made it less so. Chapter 5. The bed, sex, intimacy, and the church in your bedroom. Let's talk about the bedroom. Or rather, let's talk about the space where the bed was, because as we've established, the medieval peasant home didn't have a separate bedroom in the modern sense. The bed, or the straw mattress, or the pile of rags, depending on your economic position, was in the same room as everything else, separated from the rest of life by approximately nothing. Privacy in the modern sense was not available. What happened in the bed happened in the presence of, at minimum, the ambient sounds and proximity of the household. This matters because the church had a great deal to say about what happened in the bed, and the church's position on marital sex is one of the most elaborate, most specific, and most genuinely fascinating bodies of theological and legal thinking in the medieval period. The church was in your bedroom in a way that has no modern equivalent, not just as a vague cultural presence, but as an institution with detailed rules about when, how, in what position, and for what purpose sexual activity within marriage was permissible. Let's start with the basic theological framework, because without it, the specific rules don't make sense. The medieval church inherited from the early Christian theologians, particularly Augustine of Hippo, whose influence on medieval theology cannot be overstated, a deeply ambivalent attitude toward human sexuality. On one hand, marriage was a sacrament, sex within marriage was legitimate, and the production of children was one of the primary goods that justified the institution. On the other hand, sexual desire itself, the involuntary, animal urgency of physical attraction, was associated with the fall, with the corruption of human nature by original sin, with the part of human experience that was most resistant to rational control, and therefore most suspected by a theological tradition that valued reason and will over appetite and feeling. The result of this inheritance was a theology of marital sex that was simultaneously permissive. Sex within marriage is not sinful, and hedged with an elaborate structure of conditions and limitations designed to keep the permitted activity from sliding into the territory of sinful excess. The goal was sex that was rational, purposeful, controlled. Sex that served the legitimate ends of marriage without becoming an occasion for the kind of uncontrolled pleasure that the theological tradition associated with sin. The legitimate ends of marriage, as medieval theologians identified them, were the procreation of children, the avoidance of fornication, the provision of a legitimate outlet for sexual desire that would otherwise seek illegitimate expression, and the rendering of the conjugal debt. These three purposes, each with its own theological justification and its own implications for when and how sex within marriage was appropriate, organized the Church's teaching on marital sexuality. The conjugal debt is perhaps the most interesting of these concepts from a modern perspective, because it is the most directly about the rights and obligations of the two people in the marriage. The debt, debitum conjugal, was the obligation of each spouse to be sexually available to the other upon request. This is not about desire. It is not about love or affection or mutual attraction. It is about obligation. You have entered a marriage, and marriage creates a debt of sexual availability that you are required to fulfill. The conjugal debt ran in both directions. The husband owed it to the wife, and the wife owed it to the husband, equally and reciprocally. This bilateral obligation was, in the context of medieval theology and law, genuinely significant. It meant that a wife had a legal and theological right to her husband's sexual availability, not just a husband's right to his wife's. In a legal framework that gave women remarkably few rights relative to men, the reciprocal conjugal debt was one of the places where women had a formally recognized claim. Refusing to pay the conjugal debt, consistently denying your spouse's reasonable requests, was a marital failure with real consequences. It could be grounds for a separation. It was certainly grounds for theological condemnation. And in the practical context of a marriage in which the production of children was both a social expectation and an economic necessity, the refusal of sex had implications beyond the bedroom. But the debt was not unlimited. The Church was specific about when the debt should not be paid, and the list of prohibited times was extensive enough to significantly constrain the calendar of permissible marital sex. Prohibited times included Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, the days associated with specific religious observances, the major liturgical seasons, Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, Lent, the 40 days before Easter, and the period between Easter and Pentecost in some traditions, the 3 days before receiving communion, during pregnancy in many canonical formulations, during menstruation, during lactation in some traditions, on feast days, of which the medieval calendar had a significant number. If you do the arithmetic on these prohibitions, you arrive at a situation where the days on which marital sex was theologically permissible were a minority of the calendar. Medieval penitential manuals, the guides for confessors that told them how to assess and assign penance for various sins, took this accounting seriously, and the surviving manuals contain exactly this kind of calculation, working out how many days in a year were available for permissible marital sex after the prohibitions were applied. The practical question of whether medieval people actually observed all these prohibitions is, of course, distinct from the question of what the Church said they should do. The confession records and the penitential manuals exist precisely because people were regularly confessing to having sex at prohibited times, which tells you both that the prohibition was taken seriously enough to generate guilt, and that it was violated often enough to be a routine matter for the confessor. The position was also regulated. This is the detail that tends to produce the most raised eyebrows in modern audiences, but the medieval church's position on sexual positions within marriage was a real and developed theological position. The acceptable position, the position that was not inherently sinful within marriage, was what we might call the missionary position, on the theological grounds that it was the position most suited to procreation and least associated with the kind of animal, pleasure-seeking, sexual behavior that the theological tradition was most worried about. Other positions were categorized in the penitential literature with varying degrees of concern. Some were assigned penances, some were considered more problematic than others. The reasoning was always connected to the procreative purpose of sex, and to the degree to which the position seemed oriented toward pleasure rather than reproduction. The penitential manuals are extraordinary documents for the historian of medieval sexuality because they reveal, in their careful cataloging of what needed to be confessed and assigned penance, the range of what was actually happening. You don't write detailed guidance for confessors about sexual behaviors that nobody is engaging in. The specificity of the penitential literature is a kind of negative image of medieval sexual life. You can read from what was being confessed something about what was being done. What was being done was apparently quite varied, and the confessors were working through it with the thoroughness that the sacrament of penance required. The Church also had strong views about contraception. The procreative purpose of marital sex meant that deliberate prevention of procreation was, in the canonical framework, a serious sin. It was treating the sexual act as being for pleasure alone, separating it from its primary legitimate purpose. Various contraceptive methods existed in the medieval period: herbal preparations, physical barriers, coitus interruptus, and the penitential literature addresses them as sins requiring confession and penance. Coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method, appears in the penitential literature as one of the most commonly confessed sexual sins, which again tells you something about how frequently it was practiced, whatever the Church thought about it. Medieval people, like people in every period, had reasons to want to limit fertility. The economic pressure of too many children, the genuine physical danger of repeated pregnancy for women, the simple human preference for some control over reproduction, and they used the means available to them. Church prohibition notwithstanding, the intersection of the Church's sexual rules with the reality of medieval bodies and medieval lives produced a situation that was, for many medieval people, a continuous negotiation between the ideal and the possible. The ideal was a marital sexuality that was purposeful, controlled, correctly timed, and oriented toward procreation. The possible was the sexuality of real human beings living in small spaces with their spouses, managing desire and obligation and the various pressures of embodied life in the specific historical conditions of the medieval world. The confession was the mechanism that mediated between the ideal and the possible. The penitent confessed what they had done, the confessor assigned an appropriate penance, and the cycle continued, the Church maintaining its standards, the population maintaining its behaviors, and the gap between the two being managed through the sacramental system on a more or less weekly basis. Now let's talk about what wasn't regulated by the Church, the emotional and intimate texture of the marital bed, the things that don't appear in the penitential literature because they weren't categorized as sins. Sleep is the obvious one. Medieval couples slept together, not metaphorically, but literally in the same bed, because beds were valuable objects that were not multiplied unnecessarily. The shared bed was the physical space of the closest proximity available in a marriage, and the intimacy of shared sleep, the warmth, the unconscious physical presence of another body, was part of the daily texture of married life that the historical record mostly doesn't capture because it was too ordinary to record. The conversations that happened in bed, the whispered discussions of the household's affairs, the plans for the next day, the confidences exchanged in the dark when the rest of the household was asleep. These were among the most private moments available to a medieval couple, and they were the space where the emotional content of the marriage could exist without an audience. The bed, in this sense, was the closest thing to genuine privacy that most medieval married couples had. Medical literature of the medieval period, drawing on the ancient tradition that had been transmitted through Islamic scholarship and reintroduced to the West, discussed the health benefits of marital sex in terms that were more positive than the penitential literature's tone of anxious regulation. Moderate marital sex was considered healthy. It maintained the balance of humors, provided the body with beneficial stimulation, and produced the mutual benefit that the Galenic medical tradition associated with proper sexual activity. The medical literature was not in conflict with the theological literature in recognizing marital sex as legitimate. It was in some ways more positive about it, focusing on the health benefits rather than the sin risks. The medical literature also discussed female pleasure. The ancient tradition held that female pleasure and female orgasm were necessary for conception, on the theory that women produced their own seed that needed to be released in the sexual act for pregnancy to occur. This was wrong anatomically, but the medical theory had practical implications. It meant that female pleasure was, within this framework, not merely permissible, but medically functional, a necessary component of the reproductive process that marriage was partly about. The medieval bed, in other words, was not only a site of theological regulation and anxious penance, it was also a site of human intimacy, of physical warmth, of the specific closeness that develops between people who have slept beside each other for years. The historical record is better at capturing the regulation than the intimacy, because regulation produces documents, and intimacy mostly doesn't. But the intimacy was there. In the cold of the medieval night, in the small spaces of the medieval home, in the daily proximity of two people who had been put together by arrangement or by choice, and who had to make something from what they had. Chapter 6. The Children, Pregnancy, Birth, and the Reality of Medieval Parenthood. You are pregnant. If you are the wife in this medieval marriage, you have been pregnant before, and you will be pregnant again, and the interval between those pregnancies has been shorter than you would have chosen if the choice had been entirely yours. The medieval reproductive experience for women was, in simple quantitative terms, one of the most demanding aspects of medieval female life. The combination of frequent pregnancy, the genuine physical danger of childbirth, the high rate of infant and child mortality, and the emotional weight of all of these together made reproduction one of the central experiences around which medieval women's lives were organized. Let's be specific about the numbers, because the numbers matter. A medieval woman who survived to adulthood and married, and not all women did because female childhood mortality was high, could expect to be pregnant multiple times across her reproductive years. The average number of pregnancies for a medieval woman who survived to menopause was somewhere between 5 and 8, depending on the period, the region, and the social class. Peasant women who breastfed their own children, which suppresses ovulation and provides a degree of natural birth spacing, had somewhat longer intervals between pregnancies than aristocratic women who gave their children to wet nurses and, therefore, resumed fertility sooner. The outcome of those pregnancies was not always a live child. Miscarriage rates in the medieval period, in the absence of modern prenatal care, in the context of nutritional deficiencies and physical labor, and the various infections and illnesses that went untreated, were significant. Stillbirth was more common than in modern contexts, and of the children who were born alive, a significant proportion. Estimates vary, but are generally in the range of 30 to 50%. died before reaching adulthood, with the highest mortality in the first year of life. These numbers are not abstractions. They are the framework within which every medieval couple managed their family life. Having children with the knowledge that not all of them would survive, caring for infants in the shadow of the mortality that surrounded infancy, building their household with the awareness that the household's future was uncertain in a way that modern parents, with modern medicine, don't face in quite the same way. The pregnancy itself, for a medieval woman, was managed with a combination of medical knowledge, traditional practice, religious observance, and the practical wisdom of other women who had been through it. The physician, formally trained in Galenic medicine, university educated, available in cities and to the wealthy, was not the primary resource for most pregnant women. The midwife was. The network of women, mothers, neighbors, experienced women in the community who had knowledge of pregnancy and childbirth, and who provided the practical support that the formal medical system didn't reach, was the real infrastructure of medieval obstetric care. The midwife's role in medieval childbirth was central in a way that goes beyond the medical. She was present at the birth. She managed the labor. She made the decisions about what to do if things went wrong. She was also, in the event of a child's death, the person who could perform emergency baptism. Because the unbaptized soul was, in the medieval religious framework, at risk, and the urgency of baptism in cases of endangered life meant that the midwife had a quasi-clerical function as the person who could provide the sacrament when the priest couldn't reach in time. This spiritual responsibility was taken seriously. Midwives could be called before ecclesiastical authorities to confirm that they had properly administered emergency baptism. The Church's interest in the midwife was precisely this: the control of the threshold moment between life and death, the ensuring that souls entered the world properly received into the Church's care. The physical experience of medieval childbirth was, by modern standards, dangerous. Without modern surgical interventions, without the cesarean section performed under anesthesia, without the blood transfusions that can manage hemorrhage, without the antibiotics that can address postpartum infection, the complications that modern obstetrics manages routinely were, in the medieval period, potentially fatal. Obstructed labor, hemorrhage, infection in the days following delivery. Each of these could and did kill medieval women with a frequency that makes childbirth one of the primary causes of female mortality in the period. The maternal mortality rate in the medieval period is difficult to calculate with precision from the available evidence, but estimates suggest that somewhere between 1 and 3% of births resulted in the mother's death, which sounds low until you consider that a woman might go through this experience 5 to 8 times across her reproductive life, at which point the cumulative risk becomes much more significant. Medieval people knew this. The danger of childbirth was not hidden or minimized in the medieval period. It was acknowledged, prayed against, prepared for. The prayers said over a pregnant woman, the vows made to saints on her behalf, the offerings made at shrines associated with safe delivery. These were not superstitious gestures. They were rational responses to a genuine risk in a context where the only supernatural assistance was the only assistance available. The birth itself happened at home, not in a hospital, not in a specialized medical facility, but in the house where the woman lived, in the bed or on the birthing chair, attended by the midwife and by the women of her family and community who had gathered to help and support. Men were excluded from the birth chamber. Childbirth was women's territory, managed by women, supported by women. The husband waited outside, as men did, and what he felt during that waiting, the anxiety, the helplessness, the awareness of what was at risk, is documented in the letters and accounts that survive from medieval men whose wives were in labor. After the birth, the new mother underwent a period of recovery and religious transition. The churching of women, the ceremony of purification and thanksgiving performed at the church after a woman had recovered from childbirth, was an important ritual of the medieval period, marking the end of the lying-in period and the return of the woman to full social participation. The theological status of churching was debated. Was it purification, implying that childbirth was somehow polluting? Or thanksgiving, celebrating the safe delivery? Different theological positions took different views, but the practice was widespread, and women themselves valued it, attending in their best clothes, bringing candles and offerings, marking the occasion as significant. The child, once born and surviving, entered a household that had specific practices around infant care that differed from modern ones in ways that had real consequences. Swaddling, the tight wrapping of the infant in bands of cloth, was standard practice for newborns in the medieval period. The rationale was a combination of the practical, it kept the infant warm and contained, and the theoretical, it was believed that swaddling helped the limbs grow straight, that the infant's soft bones needed the support. Modern medicine considers tight swaddling potentially harmful to hip development, but medieval practice was consistent and widespread. Breastfeeding was standard for most medieval women, not for ideological reasons, but for practical ones, since it was the safest available form of infant nutrition. Upper-class women used wet nurses, women hired specifically to breastfeed the children of others, partly because breastfeeding was considered incompatible with the social obligations and sexual availability expected of aristocratic wives, and partly because it was considered a lower status activity that well-born women delegated to servants. The wet nurse was a significant figure in the lives of aristocratic children, often the person to whom they were most closely attached in infancy. Godparents, fent, chosen at baptism, which happened as soon as possible after birth, took on real responsibilities in the medieval period. The godparent relationship was a spiritual kinship that created genuine obligations. The godparent was responsible for the child's religious education, for support in times of difficulty, for the kind of backup parenting that the biological parents' deaths, never an unlikely contingency in a world with high adult mortality, would make necessary. Godparents were chosen from the social network with care, partly because the relationship created the kind of mutual obligation that was the foundation of medieval social networks. The death of children was a regular feature of medieval family life, and the question of how medieval parents experienced that loss, whether they felt it as modern parents feel child loss, or whether the expectation of high mortality created a different emotional framework, has been debated by historians for decades. The traditional view, associated most prominently with the historian Philippa Ariès, was that medieval people didn't invest emotionally in children the way modern parents do, that the high mortality rate produced a kind of emotional distancing that protected parents from the full impact of loss. This view has been substantially revised. The evidence from the actual historical record, the prayers, the wills, the letters, the saints' lives that recorded miracles involving the healing of sick children who their parents had desperately sought help for, shows medieval parents who were deeply invested in their children's survival and deeply affected by their deaths. A medieval father who carried his dying child to a saint's shrine, who made desperate vows on the child's behalf, who returned home without the child and recorded his grief in whatever form was available to him. That father was not emotionally detached from his child. He was a parent who loved his child and lost them in a world that had nothing adequate to offer against that loss, except prayer and the hope of divine intervention. The grief of medieval parents over dead children is one of the most human things in the historical record, and it crosses the centuries with a directness that makes the temporal distance irrelevant. Chapter 7. The Law. What legal marriage actually meant for power in the household. You have been married for several years now. You have children, some of whom have survived, some of whom haven't, and the household has been shaped by both the presence of the living and the absence of the dead, in ways that don't fully show in the daily routine, but are present, as absences always are, in the texture of everything. The household is running, the partnership is functioning, and today, for reasons that will become clear, you have a legal problem. The legal framework of medieval marriage was, from a modern perspective, one of the most asymmetrical aspects of the institution, more asymmetrical than the economic arrangements, more asymmetrical than the theological rules, because the law organized the fundamental question of power within the household in ways that concentrated it almost entirely in the husband's hands. Let's start with the concept of coverture, which was the organizing legal principle of married women's status in the common law tradition. The English legal system that is the most extensively documented and that influenced much of the broader Western legal framework. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She ceased upon marriage to be a separate legal person in most significant respects. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. Legal actions she was party to were brought by or against the marital unit, represented by the husband. She could not make contracts in her own name. She could not own property independently. Any property she brought to the marriage, or that came to her during it through inheritance or gift, became her husband's property upon marriage, managed by him and subject to his control. The dowry, the property that the wife's family brought to the marriage, was a significant exception that requires careful explanation. The dowry was not the wife's property in the sense that she could control it. It was transferred to the husband's management at marriage, contributing to the household's economic resources under his administration. What the wife retained was not the dowry itself, but a claim on it. If the marriage ended through her husband's death, she had a right to her dower, the portion of his estate that had been pledged to her at the church door, which was her provision for widowhood. The distinction matters. The wife didn't own her property independently during the marriage. She had a future claim on provision if she survived her husband, which the law would enforce. But during the marriage, the management and direction of the household's economic resources was the husband's prerogative. This had specific practical implications. A wife who wanted to make a major decision about the household's property, to sell land, to make a significant purchase, to enter a commercial contract, needed her husband's agreement. Without it, the transaction was legally void, or at least legally vulnerable, in ways that made parties unwilling to contract with a married woman acting alone. The wife of a merchant couldn't, in most legal frameworks, independently operate as a merchant in her own name, unless she was recognized as a female sole trader, a specific legal category in some jurisdictions that allowed married women in certain trades to contract independently. The female solely status was a practical adaptation to the reality that in many urban commercial households, the wife was doing the actual business, managing the shop, conducting the trade, extending credit and collecting debts, and the legal framework needed to accommodate this reality. But it was an exception to the general rule of coverture, a carve-out created by practical necessity rather than a recognition of married women's general legal capacity. The law also addressed violence within marriage in ways that reveal both the protections available to medieval women and the significant limits of those protections. The husband's right to chastise his wife, to physically discipline her, was a real legal concept in the medieval period. The famous rule of thumb, the suggestion that a husband could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb, may be apocryphal as a formal legal rule. But the underlying concept that moderate physical correction of a wife by her husband was legally permissible was real and documented. The law drew a distinction between reasonable correction and excessive violence, but the line was not always clearly drawn, and the enforcement of even the limit on excess was inconsistent. The ecclesiastical courts, the church courts that had jurisdiction over marriage matters, provided one avenue of recourse for women whose husband's violence was severe enough to constitute what the canon law called sevitia, cruelty that created genuine danger to life or health. A woman who could prove sevitia before an ecclesiastical court could obtain a separation, not a divorce, but permission to live apart from her husband, with arrangements for her maintenance. The marriage bond remained. The obligation to return when the danger was addressed remained, but the immediate physical situation could be legally separated. The practical difficulty of pursuing this remedy was, as with all medieval legal remedies, significant. Accessing an ecclesiastical court required knowledge, proximity to a court, the ability to present a case, and in many instances, the financial resources to pursue it. A peasant woman in a remote manor whose husband was violent had considerably fewer practical options than an urban woman in a town with an active ecclesiastical court and a supportive family network. The family network was, in practice, one of the most important protections available to medieval women in difficult marriages. The wife's family, her parents, brothers, cousins, retained an interest in her welfare after her marriage, partly because family honor was implicated in how she was treated, and partly because genuine family affection motivated concern for her well-being. A husband who treated his wife badly was not only failing his ecclesiastical obligations, he was creating a problem with his in-laws, whose social, economic, and sometimes physical response was a real constraint on his behavior. The Lord, in the feudal context, also had some interest in the welfare of the people under his authority, including their wives. A lord whose tenant was creating disorder through domestic violence might intervene to resolve it, partly because disorder was bad for the manor generally, and partly because the lord had obligations as well as rights toward the people under his governance. These social and familial pressures were not legal mechanisms. They didn't produce formal records. They operated in the informal networks of community obligation and family loyalty that structured medieval social life. But they were real, and they provided protections for women that the formal legal framework didn't always reach. The law also, interestingly, gave wives certain specific powers and responsibilities that the general picture of coverture might obscure. The wife, as household manager, had real authority within her domain. She controlled the household's internal operations, the management of servants, the oversight of food production and storage, the organization of the domestic economy. This was not a minor portfolio. In the absence of her husband, when he was traveling, on military campaign, or conducting business away from the estate, the wife stepped into his full managerial role, making decisions, appearing in local courts on the household's behalf, managing the estate with the full authority that the situation required. The records of English manorial courts contain women appearing and acting on their household's behalf, paying dues, making agreements, pursuing claims in exactly this way. The legal fiction of coverture didn't always map onto the practical reality of who was actually running things when the husband wasn't there. And given the frequency with which medieval men were absent from their households, for war, for trade, for the various obligations of medieval life, wives who managed independently were not exceptional. They were common. The widow's legal position was, by contrast with the married woman's, considerably more independent. A widow recovered legal personhood. She could sue and be sued, own property, make contracts, run a business. The widow of a craftsman could continue his business, maintain his guild membership, employ apprentices. The widow of a merchant could continue trading. The widow of a landowner managed her dower lands with full authority. Widowhood was therefore, paradoxically, a position of relative legal power for medieval women, more power than they had as daughters, under paternal control, or as wives, under marital coverture. The wealthy widow was one of the most legally powerful categories of person available to medieval women, which is one reason why the remarriage of wealthy widows was a matter of such social and political interest. The remarriage would return them to coverture, transferring their wealth and legal capacity back into a husband's hands. Some wealthy widows resisted remarriage for exactly this reason. They valued the independence that widowhood provided. Others were pressured into remarriage by family interest, by lordly control over the remarriage of feudal widows, by the practical difficulty of managing independently in a world that organized most things around male headship of household. The tension between the widow's relative freedom and the pressures toward remarriage is one of the more revealing fault lines in the medieval gender system. Chapter 8. The Church. How religion shaped the daily experience of being married. The church was everywhere in your medieval marriage. Not metaphorically, literally everywhere in the calendar that organized your year, in the rituals that marked its significant moments, in the courts that adjudicated its disputes, in the theology that told you what your marriage meant and what it required of you. Let's map the church's presence in the married life you're living, because it is more comprehensive and more interesting than the simple narrative of religious interference in private life suggests. The liturgical calendar organized the year. The seasons of Advent and Lent, the two great penitential seasons of the church year, structured the rhythm of the married household as surely as the agricultural seasons did. In Lent especially, the fasting requirements, the restrictions on certain activities, the intensification of religious observance changed the texture of daily life in ways that affected everything from what the household ate to the emotional and social register of the month. The feast days, of which there were many, dotted throughout the year to honor saints and mark significant moments in the Christian story, were days off from agricultural labor, days of community gathering, days of celebration that were simultaneously religious observances and social occasions. The parish church was the center around which this community life organized, and attendance at Sunday Mass and the major feasts was not optional. It was the basic obligation of Christian membership, and the social pressure of the community enforced it as effectively as any formal authority. The parish itself, the local church, and the community organized around it was the primary institution of medieval social life at the local level. The priest was not just a religious functionary. He was the administrator of the key life events: birth, baptism, marriage, death, last rites, burial, and the holder of information about the community that no other institution maintained. The parish records, where they were kept, were the medieval equivalent of the civil register, the documentation of who had been born, married, and buried in the community. The priest's relationship with married couples was ongoing in the specific way that the confession required. Annual confession, at minimum before Easter, was a canonical obligation for all Christians. The confession involved, as we've discussed, the examination of the full range of one's moral conduct, including conduct within marriage. The priest was therefore regularly informed about the intimate lives of his parishioners in ways that created a specific, complicated relationship between the confessor and the penitent. The confessor's manual, the guide for parish priests conducting confessions, devoted significant space to the examination of married penitents about their marital conduct. The priest was instructed to ask, carefully and without prurience, whether the penitent had fulfilled the conjugal debt, observed the prohibited times, avoided prohibited practices, treated their spouse appropriately, fulfilled their parenting obligations. The manual was careful about how these questions should be asked, not in ways that suggested sins the penitent hadn't committed, not with the kind of detail that would create scandal, but the questions were to be asked. This regular examination of marital conduct by the confessor was one mechanism by which the church maintained its presence in the married household. Another was the system of ecclesiastical courts, which we've discussed in the context of marriage validity and separation, but which also heard cases of marital misconduct more broadly. A husband who was failing to maintain his wife, a wife who was accused of adultery, a couple whose marital breakdown was creating community disorder. These matters could come before the ecclesiastical courts as well as the secular ones. The church's teaching on marriage was not only regulatory, it was also, in a genuine sense, elevating. It proposed a vision of marriage as a sacrament, as a holy thing, as a relationship that participated in the sacred order of the universe in a way that made it more than a mere contract or economic arrangement. The sacramental theology of marriage, developed most fully by theologians like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, held that the marriage of baptized Christians was a sacrament, a visible sign of an invisible grace, a channel through which God's grace entered the world. The sacrament was constituted by the couple's consent. They were the ministers of the sacrament to each other, which was unusual in the medieval sacramental system, where priests were normally the ministers. This meant that the married couple, in their act of consent, were doing something sacred, not just social, not just legal, but participating in the divine order in a specific and meaningful way. The extension of this theology into the lived experience of marriage was imperfect. The gap between the theological ideal and the practical reality was as large here as in the realm of sexual regulation, but the theology shaped the cultural understanding of what marriage was for and why it mattered, and that shaping was real, even when the lived experience fell significantly short of the ideal. The Church also provided the primary framework for understanding the suffering that marriage could involve. The death of a spouse, the death of children, the hardship of illness and poverty, and the various calamities that medieval life regularly produced. All of these were interpreted through a theological framework that gave them meaning, or at least context. The suffering was not random. It was part of a divine order that the individual couldn't fully see, but could trust. The prayers said for a dead child, the masses offered for a dead spouse, the pilgrimage made in thanksgiving for a recovery from illness. These were the Church's infrastructure for processing the losses that medieval life regularly imposed. The saints, the intercessors who occupied the space between the human and the divine, were central to the devotional life of married couples in ways that modern secular life has no real equivalent for. There were saints specifically associated with marriage and fertility. Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, was prayed to for fertility. Saint Nicholas was associated with the protection of children. Various local saints had specific associations with specific aspects of married and family life, and the devotional practice of appealing to them, through prayer, through votive offerings, through pilgrimage to their shrines, was integrated into the practical management of the household's welfare. A medieval couple who wanted a child prayed to Saint Anne and made an offering at her shrine. A medieval couple whose child was ill made vows on the child's behalf to a saint associated with healing. A medieval woman in difficult labor was commended to the Virgin Mary, whose own motherhood was the central example of divine care for human birth. The religious and the practical were not separate domains in medieval life. They were continuous, the one flowing into the other. The prayers as practical a response to the situation as the midwife's attendance. The Church here also provided the framework for the emotional rhythms of the married household. The joy of Christmas and Easter, the great celebrations of the Christian story, was domestically expressed in the feasting and the gathering that marked these moments. The solemnity of Lent was domestically expressed in the fasting and the restriction and the heightened religious observance that the season required. The household participated in the liturgical year, as surely as it participated in the agricultural one, and the two calendars together organized the experience of time in the medieval year. The bells of the parish church, ringing for the daily canonical hours, for Sunday Mass, for the feast days, for the deaths of community members, were the acoustic environment of medieval daily life. You woke to them, worked through them, organized your day around them, heard them mark the deaths of your neighbors and eventually of the people you loved. They were the constant background of the medieval soundscape, the Church's presence made audible in every moment of the day. You are living inside all of this, the theology and the courts and the confessions and the calendar and the bells. All of it is the context within which your married life unfolds, the water in which you swim so constantly that you don't notice it as something separate from yourself. It is not external to your marriage. It is constitutive of it. It shapes what you think your marriage means, what you expect from it, what you understand as its obligations and its gifts. The medieval married couple was not living inside an institution they had chosen. They were living inside an institution that had been organized around them by forces, family law, church, economic necessity, social obligation, that preceded them and would outlast them. Their task was not to construct the marriage, but to inhabit it, to make from the structure they had been given something that was livable, something that was human, something that was, in the best cases, genuinely good. And many of them did. The evidence of medieval married life is not only the evidence of hardship and asymmetry and high ecclesiastical regulation and legal constraint. It is also the evidence of partnerships that worked, of affections that developed and lasted, of households that functioned, and families that held together through the difficulties that the medieval world regularly imposed. The medieval marriage was complicated, constrained, dangerous, and sometimes genuinely terrible. it was also the institution inside which most medieval people lived most of their lives. And most medieval people, like most people in most times, wanted to live those lives well. The want was human. The making of something from what they had was human. And the evidence, when you look carefully enough, is that many of them succeeded. Chapter 9. The Crisis. When medieval marriages met catastrophe, your marriage is in trouble. Not the slow, grinding trouble of incompatibility or the legal trouble of property disputes, though those exist in abundance in the medieval world. And we'll get to them. This is a different kind of trouble. The acute, sudden, world restructuring trouble that the medieval environment was uniquely equipped to deliver without warning and without mercy. The kind of trouble that arrived in the form of a wet summer that rotted the harvest, or a lord's demand that exceeded what the household could provide, or a fever that moved through the village with the indiscriminate thoroughness of something that has no interest in whether you can afford to lose anyone. The medieval marriage existed inside conditions of material precarity that modern marriages, even difficult ones, don't directly replicate. The distance between a functioning household and a household in crisis was much shorter in the 13th century than it is now, and the crises that could collapse that distance were more numerous, more sudden, and less amenable to intervention than the ones modern people navigate. Let's start with famine, because famine was the most comprehensive of the crises that medieval marriages faced, the one that restructured everything simultaneously. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is the most severe famine in medieval European history, and it provides the most complete picture of what systematic food shortage did to married households at every level of society. The famine was triggered by a series of catastrophically wet summers. The summer rains that should have produced grain instead drowned the crops year after year in a run of bad weather that the medieval agricultural system had no buffer adequate to absorb. In the first year, households drew on their reserves, the grain stored from the previous harvest, the preserved foods that were part of normal household management. In the second year, the reserves were gone and the hunger was real. By the third and fourth years, the famine was lethal, and the decisions that married couples were making were the decisions of people in extremis. Which child gets the remaining food? Whether to eat the seed grain that was supposed to plant next year's crop, whether to sell the ox that was the household's primary agricultural instrument in exchange for food that would keep the family alive through the winter, but leave them unable to farm in the spring. These were not hypothetical decisions. They were the actual decisions of actual households, documented in the records of the period, the manorial records, the court records, the chronicle accounts that describe the famine's effects with a specificity that makes the abstraction of historical statistics concrete and human. The famine restructured marriages in specific ways. It increased mortality, obviously. The death toll of the Great Famine is estimated in the millions across Northern Europe, which meant that marriages ended in the specific crisis conditions of the famine years, with widows and widowers managing households that had lost the labor of a partner in circumstances that made that loss maximally difficult to absorb. It increased the abandonment of children. Parents who could not feed their children left them at monastery doors, at the doors of wealthier households, at any institution that might provide for them, in decisions that were desperate and permanent, and that severed the family in ways that the famine survivors carried for the rest of their lives. It also, in some documented cases, produced the opposite: the closing of the household around itself, the intensification of the partnership between husband and wife, as they managed together through a crisis that required everything both of them had. The famine records contain cases of couples working together in the specific way that genuine crisis can produce, sharing what they had, making collective decisions about how to manage the depletion of their resources, maintaining the household through conditions that would have broken it if they hadn't been genuinely committed to making it work. And then, in 1347, before the generation that had survived the famine had entirely recovered, the Black Death arrived. The Black Death the pandemic of bubonic and pneumonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, killed somewhere between a third and half of the European population in its initial wave between 1347 and 1351, and returned in recurring waves through the rest of the 14th century and beyond. Its effect on medieval marriages was comprehensive, immediate, and deeply strange, because the plague killed with a speed and indiscrimination that made ordinary frameworks for understanding death inadequate. The plague arrived in a household and killed, not selectively, not taking the old and the sick while sparing the young and the healthy, the way that medieval people were more accustomed to thinking about mortality. It took children and parents simultaneously. It took healthy men and women in their 30s and 40s. It took the husband and left the wife, or the wife and left the husband, or both, and left the children, or the children, and left the parents, with a randomness that seemed to violate the moral structure through which medieval people organized their understanding of death. The speed of death from plague, the time between the appearance of the first symptoms, and death was sometimes as short as 3 days, sometimes a week, meant that there was no time for the gradual preparation that medieval culture organized around death. The dying person was supposed to have time to receive the last rites, to make confession, to say goodbye, to set their affairs in order. The plague frequently denied all of this. People died unshriven, unconfessed, without the sacramental preparation that the medieval religious framework considered essential for a good death, and the theological implications of this. What happened to souls who died without the last rites added a specific religious horror to the epidemic's physical horror. The chronicles of the plague period describe the effects on marriage and family with a directness that is difficult to read without visceral response. Parents who would not approach their sick children, husbands who left sick wives, the abandonment of the dying by people who should have stayed. Abandonment not out of cruelty, but out of the specific overwhelming terror of a disease that seemed to spread through contact, that seemed to make care itself lethal. And the people who stayed, the wives who nursed sick husbands, knowing the risk, the husbands who sat with dying wives and held their hands through the deaths that the plague delivered. These people are also in the record, less dramatically than the abandonment cases, because their faithfulness generated fewer scandalous chronicle entries, but present in the evidence of who died together, who was buried together, who survived and who didn't. The aftermath of the plague transformed the material conditions of married life in ways that were, paradoxically, in some respects, improvements. The massive population loss created labor shortages that shifted economic power toward the surviving peasant population. Labor was suddenly scarce and therefore more valuable, and the feudal arrangements that had extracted so much from peasant households were under pressure from below. The peasants who survived the plague had more bargaining power than their parents had, and the century following the Black Death saw a gradual erosion of the most oppressive aspects of serfdom in many parts of Western Europe. The marriage market was also transformed by the plague's demographic effects. With so many spouses dead, so many households without a managing partner, the remarriage market moved quickly and with an urgency that produced unions that might not have happened under normal demographic conditions. Widows and widowers with property and household management skills were in demand as spouses in ways that the ordinary marriage market didn't always reflect. The post-plague period saw rapid remarriage, the reconfiguration of households, the bringing together of families in new combinations as survivors rebuilt. Beyond the great catastrophes, the famine, the plague, the medieval marriage also faced the more ordinary crises that the medieval environment produced with dependable regularity. Illness was the most consistent of these. The medieval body was subject to diseases that modern medicine has either eliminated or made manageable. Smallpox, tuberculosis, malaria in some regions, the various epidemic diseases that moved through populations in the pre-vaccination world. And the illness of a household member restructured the household immediately and potentially permanently. The illness of the husband, the person responsible for the agricultural or commercial production that sustained the household. Through the management of that production onto the wife, in whatever form she could manage it. The illness of the wife, the person responsible for the internal management of the household, created the specific crisis of an unmaintained household, uncooked food, uncared for children, unbrewed ale. Medieval medicine, the Galenic tradition applied through physicians for the wealthy and empirical folk practice for everyone else, had genuine limitations in dealing with acute illness. The humoral framework that organized medieval medical thinking produced interventions, bleeding, purging, dietary adjustment, herbal preparations that were sometimes helpful, sometimes neutral, and sometimes actively harmful. The physician who bled a feverish patient was following a coherent theoretical framework. The result was a patient who was feverish and had also lost blood, which is not an improvement, but the household's response to illness was not only medical, it was organizational. The redistribution of the sick person's responsibilities to whoever could absorb them. It was social. The mobilization of the community, network of mutual assistance that the parish and the neighborhood provided. And it was religious. The prayers, the vows, the appeals to saints that were the religious infrastructure of coping with the medical reality that couldn't always be adequately addressed. The husband's absence for military service, for trade, for the various obligations of medieval life that took men away from their households for extended periods, was a regular crisis of a different kind. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a sustained structural challenge to the household's management. The wife who ran the estate while her husband was on crusade for months, sometimes years, sometimes permanently if he didn't come back, was doing something that the formal legal framework didn't fully accommodate, but that the practical reality of medieval military obligation required constantly. The letters that survive from these separations are among the most revealing documents in the history of medieval marriage. Margaret Paston writing to her husband John about the estate's management while he was in London. The wives of crusaders writing with news of the household and asking for return. The specific texture of a marriage being maintained across distance through the medium of letters that took weeks to arrive and that were sometimes the last communication before news of a death. The management of a husband's death was itself a crisis. Sudden or anticipated, it required the wife to immediately reorganize the household on a widowhood basis, to claim the dower arrangements that had been made at the church door, to navigate the legal and social process of establishing herself as a managing widow rather than a managing wife. The transition was legally and practically complex, and the widow who managed it successfully was demonstrating exactly the competence that the household partnership had been developing in her for the duration of the marriage. Chapter 10. The Widows and Widowers. What came after the marriage ended? Death ended medieval marriages. Not divorce, not separation in most cases, not the various legal mechanisms that modern people use to exit relationships that have run their course. Death, arriving with the medieval world's characteristic combination of frequency and unpredictability, was the primary way out of medieval matrimony, and the experience of widowhood, for the men and women who survived their spouses, was one of the defining experiences of medieval adult life. Given the mortality rates we've been discussing, the combination of famine, plague, military service for men, childbirth for women, and the general ambient mortality of a world without antibiotics or modern surgical intervention. Widowhood was not an exceptional experience. It was a normal one. A significant proportion of medieval adults were widowed at some point in their lives, and many were widowed more than once, their subsequent remarriages creating the complex household configurations, stepchildren, half-siblings, the various new relationships of blended families that the medieval world managed with the legal and social tools available. The widow's immediate experience after her husband's death was a combination of grief and practical urgency that left very little space for the kind of extended mourning that later periods would institutionalize. The household needed to continue functioning. The children needed to be fed. The crops, if it was an agricultural household at the wrong time of year, needed attention. The Lord's dues continued to be due, The animals continued to need care at the times they needed care. Grief in the medieval context was real. The evidence of real grief in the historical record is plentiful. But it was grief that had to be managed alongside the continuing demands of a household that didn't pause for the loss of one of its managing partners. The practical first steps of widowhood were legal. The widow needed to establish her claim to her dower, the third of her husband's estate that had been pledged to her at the church door. This involved the legal process of dower assignment, which in the English common law tradition required formal legal proceedings to identify and assign the specific properties that constituted the dower third. This process could be smooth if the husband's estate was uncomplicated and the heirs cooperative. It could be genuinely difficult if the heirs, the husband's sons from the same or a previous marriage, other relatives with claims on the estate, contested the dower assignment or made the widow's life difficult in the process. The relationship between the widow and her husband's heirs was one of the structural tensions of medieval inheritance. The heirs had an interest in the estate that was potentially in competition with the widow's dower claim. Every acre assigned to her dower was an acre not immediately available to the heir. The heir who had been waiting, perhaps 4 years, for the inheritance that his father's long life had delayed, now found himself sharing the estate with his stepmother or his father's widow, who had a legal claim on a third of everything he had expected to control. This tension produced genuine conflict in many medieval households, documented in the court records and the letters and the legal accounts of widows who had to fight for the dower arrangements that had been legally established at their marriages. It also produced, in some cases, cooperative arrangements, heirs who supported their widowed mothers or stepmothers, who managed the estate together with the widow until the dower period ended or until remarriage reconfigured the arrangement. The aristocratic widow occupied a legally powerful position, as we've discussed. The freedom from coverture that widowhood conferred gave her a degree of legal independence that married women didn't have. But this freedom came with social pressure, with the expectations of family and lord, and community about what she should do with it. The lord's interest in controlling the remarriage of a widow who held land, the feudal claim on the remarriage of the tenant's widow, which required the lord's permission, was one of the most specific expressions of the way that medieval social structures constrained even the relatively free widow. The remarriage of widows, particularly wealthy widows, was a matter of significant social and economic interest, precisely because the widow controlled property that remarriage would transfer to a new husband. Families who had married daughters into estates wanted some say in who the widowed daughter married next, both to protect the family's interest in the estate and to exercise the continuing parental authority that the family understood itself to hold. Lords who had feudal claims on the remarriage wanted to ensure that their tenants' lands didn't pass to the control of someone who would be hostile to their interests. The community had opinions. Everyone had opinions. The widow herself might have different ideas. The historical record contains widows who resisted remarriage with considerable determination, who valued the independence that widowhood provided, who had decided that the management of their own affairs was preferable to returning to coverture. The letters and legal records of the period document widows who deflected suitors, who negotiated fiercely about the terms of any potential remarriage, who used the legal freedom of their widow status to conduct their lives with a self-direction that marriage had not permitted. It also contains widows who wanted to remarry and remarried quickly, who found the isolation and practical difficulty of widowhood less appealing than the partnership that marriage, whatever its constraints, had provided. The widow who remarried within months of her first husband's death was not necessarily being callous or hasty. She might be responding rationally to the practical reality that the household needed a partner, that the management of a farm or a business was harder alone than with a co-manager, that the emotional loneliness of widowhood was real, and the social institution of marriage was the available solution. The widower's experience was parallel but different in specific ways. Men who lost their wives were typically in less precarious legal positions. The law that had limited their wives' independence had not similarly constrained them, but were in more immediately precarious household management positions because the wife's domain, the internal management of the household, the food production, the childcare, was the domain that most immediately felt her absence. The widower with young children was a particular figure of social concern in the medieval world because the combination of motherless children in an unmaintained household was a crisis that the community recognized and responded to. The pressure on widowers to remarry was often quicker and more urgent than the pressure on widows, because the practical problem of an unmaintained household with young children was immediately visible and immediately demanding of solution. The remarriage of widowers was socially and legally simpler than the remarriage of widows. They faced fewer institutional constraints, no lord's permission required for a man without a widowhood dower, less family intervention in their choices. The widower who decided to remarry typically moved faster through the process than the widow who made the same decision, partly because of these fewer constraints and partly because the practical urgency of the household management crisis was pressing. The blended family that resulted from remarriage, the household containing children from the first marriage, alongside the new spouse, potentially alongside children from the new spouse's previous marriage, eventually alongside children from the new marriage, was not the exceptional configuration that the term blended family implies in modern usage. It was extremely common. The medieval household was routinely a complex configuration of relationships, half-siblings, step-siblings, step-parents, that the modern nuclear family model doesn't prepare you to imagine as normal. It was normal. It was the expected result of the mortality rates and the remarriage patterns that the medieval demographic reality produced. The stepmother was, in the medieval cultural imagination, a figure of suspicion. The folktale tradition that gives us wicked stepmothers draws on genuine cultural anxieties about the loyalty of a second wife to her predecessor's children, about the competition for resources between children of different mothers, about the allegiances of a woman whose primary bond was to the husband, who was also the father of the children she was now responsible for raising. These anxieties were not baseless. The tensions in blended households were real, documented in the legal records of inheritance disputes and the social records of family conflict. But the stepmother who cared genuinely for her predecessor's children, who managed the blended household with equity and affection, who built real relationships with the children who were technically her competitors for the household's resources. She was also present in the historical record, in the wills that provided for stepchildren with genuine care, in the letters that expressed real affection, in the evidence of households that had been put together from fragments and had made something whole. The second marriage was, for many medieval people, the better marriage, not because the first was bad, though sometimes it was, but because the second marriage was often chosen with more self-knowledge and more practical clarity about what marriage required than the first had been. The widow, or widower, who remarried had been through the institution once. They knew what partnership required. They had a better sense of what they needed from a spouse. They chose the second marriage with information that the first marriage had provided. Some second marriages were the great loves of medieval life, the partnerships that, built on the foundation of mature self-knowledge and genuine choice, achieved a depth that the arranged first marriages of youth hadn't reached. The evidence of these marriages is in the records that show couples who found each other in widowhood and built, in the years they had, something that the historical traces suggest was genuinely good. Chapter 11. The exceptions. The marriages that broke the rules. The system existed. The system was comprehensive. The system organized medieval marriage through a combination of family arrangement, legal framework, ecclesiastical regulation, and social pressure that was about as complete as a human social system gets. And people found their way around it. Not always, not easily, not without consequence. But the history of medieval marriage is also the history of people who looked at the system and found the gaps, the consent doctrine, the clandestine marriage, the specific exceptions and ambiguities that the law and the theology couldn't entirely close, and used them. The clandestine marriage was the most significant structural gap. As we established at the beginning of this script, the consent doctrine meant that two people who said the words of present consent to each other were married, regardless of whether their families approved, their Lord consented, their priest was present, or their community knew. The church repeatedly tried to close this gap, requiring bans, requiring witnesses, eventually at Trent requiring a priest. But for most of the medieval period, the gap was real, and people used it. They used it for the obvious reasons. The son who wanted to marry, the woman his family wouldn't approve, the daughter who had found someone she preferred to the man her parents had chosen, the two people who were in love in the specific urgent way that makes institutional obstacles feel less important than they actually are, and who seized on the consent doctrine as the mechanism that could make their marriage real before anyone could stop it. The ecclesiastical court records are full of these cases. The clandestine marriages that were later contested, the parties who claimed a prior contract to escape an arranged marriage, the families who challenged the validity of unions made without their knowledge. The cases reveal, in their specifics, the texture of medieval romantic life. The whispered conversations in doorways, the meetings arranged through intermediaries, the words spoken in the dark of gardens or the privacy of upper rooms that constituted, in the church's legal understanding, the sacrament of matrimony. Joan of Kent, who would later become the mother of Richard II of England, was involved in 2 clandestine marriages before her official marriage to the Black Prince. Her legal status as wife was disputed through ecclesiastical proceedings that dragged on for years, the competing claims of different men to have married her, investigated and adjudicated with the full machinery of the church courts. Her case was exceptional in its visibility and its stakes. But the underlying situation, a woman who had contracted herself to someone her family didn't approve of, using the consent doctrine as her mechanism, was not unusual in its structure. The love match, the marriage made primarily on the basis of romantic feeling rather than family arrangement, was not the norm in the medieval period, but it was not absent. The same consent doctrine that enabled clandestine marriages also enabled people who had genuine feeling for each other to act on it, if they were willing to accept the social consequences of defying their family's expectations. The letters of medieval people who found themselves in this situation are among the most humanly immediate documents in the historical record. The letter of a young man asking a woman if she would consent to be his wife. The letter of a woman explaining to her family why she had contracted herself to someone they didn't know. The letters of families in outrage, in negotiation, in the various stages of accepting a fait accompli that the consent doctrine had made legally binding, even if the family hadn't approved it. The troubadour tradition of courtly love, which we discussed as a literary genre that presented love and marriage as incompatible, was also at its edges a cultural space in which the idea of choosing a partner based on genuine feeling was at least imaginatively present. The literature doesn't endorse running off and marrying for love in the teeth of family opposition. It mostly presents love as something that happens outside marriage and stays there, but the existence of the tradition, the cultural presence of the idea that genuine feeling mattered, that the person you loved was a different and more significant category of person than the person you had been arranged to marry. This cultural presence was part of the context in which actual decisions were made. The peasant marriage, interestingly, had somewhat more room for personal choice than the aristocratic one because the stakes of the arrangement were lower. A peasant family marrying their son or daughter was making a social and economic decision, but not a decision with the political and territorial implications of an aristocratic alliance. The community pressure, the lord's permission requirements, the family expectations, all of these constrained peasant marriage choice, but they constrained it less absolutely than the comprehensive management of aristocratic marriage. And there is evidence that peasant couples had more genuine input into their partners than their aristocratic counterparts. The records of manorial courts, the local courts that handled the affairs of the peasant community, contain cases of young people who had clearly chosen their own partners, presenting their relationship as established fact and seeking the Lord's retroactive permission rather than his advance approval. The Lord's merchet was due either way, and the practical reality was that the relationship existed. The couple wanted to formalize it, and the Lord's court was the institution that would record and legitimize the arrangement. The marriages that were genuinely unusual in the medieval context, the marriages that the system was most designed to prevent, were the marriages across significant social boundaries. A nobleman marrying a peasant woman, a merchant's daughter marrying a craftsman rather than another merchant. The movement across the social lines that the marriage system was partly designed to maintain. These marriages happened. The evidence is in the court records, in the cases brought by families disputing the validity of unions that had crossed boundaries they considered impermissible, in the wills that reveal, through the bequests made to spouses of unexpected social origins, the existence of unions that had happened against the grain of the system. They happened rarely enough to be notable. They happened often enough to be documented. And they were, in every case, the result of two people making a decision that the system didn't want them to make. Using whatever mechanism was available to them, the consent doctrine or the clandestine marriage, or the sheer accomplished fact of an existing relationship, to build something from a desire that the system hadn't organized for them. These were, in their way, the most purely consensual marriages in the medieval record. Not arranged by families, not negotiated for economic advantage, not constrained by the calculations of alliance and inheritance. They were the marriages of people who had decided, in defiance of everything the system recommended, that the person in front of them was the person they wanted. The medieval marriage system existed to prevent exactly this, and it kept not quite managing to conclusion. Your marriage is old now. The wedding at the church door, the ring, the endowment, the nuptial mass, the bedding, and the feast was many years ago. The person you married then is the person across the room from you now, or is the person in the churchyard, or is someone whose absence you have learned to live around in the way that the widowed learn to accommodate the specific shape of what they've lost. The household you built is the household you built. Not the one you imagined, probably, or not exactly. The children who survived are grown, or growing. The ones who didn't survive are prayed for at Mass. The work continues, because the work always continues. The agricultural calendar doesn't pause. The animals need care at the times they need care. The Lord's dues are still due. And somewhere in all of this, in the legal arrangements and the ecclesiastical regulations and the property transfers and the social pressures and the theological framework and the daily grinding work of managing a household in a demanding physical world, somewhere in all of this, a marriage happened. Or it didn't, and you lived with the arrangement that had been made for you without it. Or it started as one and became the other. Or it was the other and remained so until the end. The medieval marriage was not a love story in the simple sense. It was a legal contract and an economic arrangement and a theological sacrament and a social institution and a productive partnership. And the love that existed within it was the love that found its way into those structures and grew there, shaped by them, sometimes constrained by them, sometimes nourished by the very difficulty they imposed. It was also the most intimate institution available in a world that didn't have very many institutions for managing the basic human needs of companionship and belonging and mutual care. For all its asymmetries and its constraints and its tendency to organize people's lives according to priorities they hadn't chosen and couldn't always influence, the medieval marriage was the framework inside which most medieval people managed the fundamental human desire to not be alone, to have someone who knew them, who shared their stakes, who would be there in the morning and the night, and the long middle of the day when the work was hard, and the weather was bad, and the world was offering nothing comfortable. The people who lived inside it were not simpler than we are. They were not less capable of love or less needful of it. They were not more resigned to hardship or less aware of the gap between what their lives were and what they might have been. They were human beings, managing the fundamental human situation, the situation of being a person who needs other people, with the tools and the structures their world provided. Some of those tools were inadequate. Some of those structures were unjust. The inequality of the legal framework, the violence that the law permitted, and the community sometimes failed to prevent, the deaths that came too soon and too often. None of this should be minimized or romanticized. The medieval marriage system had costs that fell unevenly and heavily on the people with the least power to bear them. And it also produced regularly and with the stubborn persistence of human nature operating inside whatever structures it's given, genuine love, genuine partnership, genuine households, where two people had made something from what they had, where the arrangement had become more than an arrangement, where the person across the room was the person you would choose again if the choice were yours to make. That's the full picture, the economics and the love, the law and the tenderness, the church in the bedroom, and the whispered conversations in the dark, the death of children and the survival of households, the clandestine marriages and the arranged ones, the widows who fought for their dower, and the widowers who remarried in a month because they couldn't manage the household alone. All of it together is what married life was like in the Middle Ages. It was complicated, it was human, it was theirs, and looked at carefully, looked at with the attention it deserves. It is recognizable. Not because we are the same as they were, but because the need that marriage was organized around is the same need. The need for someone who knows you. The need for someone who is in it with you. The need for the particular, ordinary, daily comfort of a person who will be there in the morning. That need didn't begin in the Middle Ages. It isn't going to end in ours.